Thanks for listening to the Scottish Housing Podcast. You can find out more about the presenters by going to scottishhousingpod.com, and you can also follow us on social media. We are on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok and Facebook. Just look up at Scottish Housing Pod. Stephen and I are joined by Stuart Patrick. If this is going to sound really stale, because it's actually the third time that we've tried to get this started on the podcast. We are having IT issues today, which as Stephen pointed out off podcast. All power to the elbow of Stuart, who says people should be back in the workplace. We'll maybe touch on that. So Stuart is the CEO of the Glasgow Chamber of Commerce. So Stuart, if you want to go ahead and once again introduce yourself to the listeners.
And I suppose that's why we were really keen to speak and get some conversation with you, Stuart, because you have been notably vocal on the issue of housing, which I think to most people wouldn't immediately think this is an issue that the Chamber of Commerce would necessarily feel strongly about, or as strongly as you have. So I suppose it's that second point you're making about the members expecting you to pursue particular policy areas, and as you've been really vocal about housing recently.
Yes, and you're right that perhaps the Chamber of Commerce hasn't said as much about housing in the past, partially I suspect because we weren't hearing so much from members about the blockage that policy could be to investment in the city's economy. And in the case particularly of the city centre, that's become very, very relevant now post-COVID with the proposals around the housing bill, that is, some of those proposals are going to have an impact on the likelihood of private investment coming in. But it's also because housing is beginning to become much more relevant to a couple of quite significant issues. One is around the development of the region's transport infrastructure, and the interplay between housing and transport is obviously fundamental. But equally, the repurposing of a city centre that has taken a bit of damage from not just the pandemic, but also the broader strategy that people have adopted moving on to more digital delivery, particularly in retail.
Mm. I think that's really interesting, because it would be very tempting for us to speak about the housing bill per se, but we've spoken a lot in the podcast about it. I wonder if you could say a wee bit more about the development of the city region and housing, and particularly that aspect of transport infrastructure. There's something we've not explored on the podcast, or again would have immediately sprung to mind as such an important issue, that interface.
Well, you may recall that Councillor Aitken commissioned a group of folks with an independent spirit to have a look at the connectivity of the city and the wider city region.
Councillor Aitken being the leader of the council at Glasgow City Council, yeah.
Indeed, and she asked Professor David Begg, who has a long history of work in the transport network, edits the transport magazine down south, and has a very strong relationship with local government in Scotland in the past. And she asked David to pull together a commission to look at what the transport requirements were going to be for the city and the region in, well, choose your time period, a decade ahead. And we came up with a commission that included myself, included folks like Professor Ian Docherty, who is, again, a very well-respected academic in transport field, and also included observation from Transport Scotland. So it was a thoughtful piece of work. And one of the biggest conclusions coming from that Connectivity Commission, which reported about 5 years ago, was that we needed to think much more carefully about where we were making housing decisions that were relevant to not just the long-term sustainability of our public transport network, but also in due course, we've now become much more attached to what the net zero implications are of encouraging people to use public transport as opposed to using private vehicles. So housing is fundamental to that. And we were particularly examining to what extent it was going to be necessary to actually reverse some of the decisions that were made post-war about the decentralisation of industry and communities to out-of-town facilities in terms of industry, new towns in terms of communities, and to what extent we had to start thinking about encouraging investment that was much closer to the existing public transport networks. And that has been reinforced, I think, by the whole shift towards the aspirations for net zero in the past 5 years. Obviously, COP26 added an extra layer of urgency to that in the home territory. So we've been discussing more recently the importance of housing as regards to how does the public transport network in bus, how does the public transport network in rail, and perhaps to a lesser extent subway. But again, I mean, you can imagine the extent at which the maximisation of productivity of the subway could be improved by appropriate housing decisions.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting you mentioned just on the subway. I've got a friend of mine, and he uses this as a discussion point about Glasgow. He supports a different football team than me, and his big complaint is the time of the subway and the times that they stop, and that there's football games going on a Sunday now on a regular basis, and you might be able to get the subway there, but you can't get it back, and there seems to be a lack of adapting to people's behaviours, and almost as if, well, this is the way we've always behaved. This is the way our transport systems, getting back to the post-war comment you make, this is the way our transport system's always been. So everything's got to be built around fitting in with the fact that that's the way it always has been and that's the way it's always going to be. So I suppose what you're talking about is sort of changing that thought process on its head and saying, no, move away from this is the way it's always been and think about what it's going to be in the future.
But particularly if you've set yourself a national target of reducing car kilometres by 20% by, I think it was by 2030, I'll be corrected by those who wrote the policy if that's wrong. But there's not an easy way of doing that if you're not going to do work to improve the public transport offer. That came out loud and clear in the Connectivity Commission work, that public transport was regarded as either not running in the from connecting the right places any longer, certainly wasn't cheap enough for certain sections of the labour market to be able to afford, and was considered to be, in some cases, unreliable or poorer quality than it needed to be. I'm not going to name the various elements of it, but you can imagine something like the subway, which was clearly designed at the end of the 19th century to connect communities, the inner city communities, with the major industrial activities along the river. Yeah. And now most of those major industrial activities have gone. And so the major purpose of the subway probably ends up being predominantly about connecting the West End with the city centre. And you know that when you get on and you can see which stations are busy and which are not. That can be changed. We can certainly encourage housing development on the south side of the river as part of the longer term aspirations for the regeneration of the River Clyde. There's loads of opportunity to do that. And it's quite helpful when you see some of the investments that are being made out of the City Deal project at the regional level. The part at Govan Bridge is a good example of another piece of new infrastructure that could help to stimulate that kind of investment on the south side of the river by connecting, make it easier for those two sides of the river to interact with that passenger bridge. So they're all interconnected. We kind of know that.
And I wonder if they are, aren't they? But I wonder if many people in the housing industry, that general industry, have caught up with the fact that actually the issue of infrastructure, which is so bedeviling, apart from the in principle debate about green belt development and urban sprawl and all of these issues about suburbia. If we are looking at a new type of housing because of the new type of economy that we're in and net zero and all these things, we actually have to think about a new type of infrastructure, don't we, in terms of our infrastructure strategy as either the city region or as a country.
And I think the question about how we develop that infrastructure, I think, came out very strongly in the Connectivity Commission, that we should be trying to build on the existing networks. If we simply allow, for example, housing developments to be spread across the region without any cognizance of where the public transport networks are, it's going to be much more expensive to deliver brand new public transport networks to unconnected communities simply by building another big housing estate outside somewhere in the region than it is trying to find ways of unlocking the available land in communities that are already close to the public transport networks. And you know that in the east end of the city, where Clyde Gateway has been working away so hard at exploiting some of the momentum that came out of the Commonwealth Games 10 years ago. But the same is true, I think, of communities like Govan. And I suppose we're asking the same question about the city centre. If we, as we know, we are going through a period of real change in behaviours and habits about how we use our city centre, and we are therefore left with some really quite remarkable assets that aren't finding a current use, then can we design policies that will help us to answer one of the questions that we created 50, 60 years ago by decentralising so dramatically? We left Glasgow city centre largely unpopulated, well, underpopulated by at least half compared to other cities of our scale. There's a real opportunity to not just, therefore, to reuse buildings that have fallen out of current use, but also to reinforce that importance of the public transport networks, which are all designed to serve as a hub and spoke into the Glasgow city centre. So can we think about policies that will make it easier to convert buildings into housing in the city centre? I think that's pretty much a cross-party industry, politics, academia. I think we all share the view that that's an opportunity to be grasped.
Your point about we moved everybody out post-war and spent all this time always demonstrated to me. When I was 18, I worked in a pub down, it was called the Lawn Bar at the time. I don't know what it's called now, Fat Bob's Ale House or something like that. And they were building the St Enoch Centre at the time. It was the bottom of St Enoch Square. And we used to shut at 10 o'clock at night, because the people who drank in that pub, who were at the time in their 60s, 70s, that used to be their local. And then they were all decanted out to Castlemilk. And the last bus to Castlemilk was at 10 o'clock at night. And it used to be the terminus bit at the bottom of the St Enoch Square. It's now gone. But the last bus to Castlemilk was at 10 o'clock at night, and they put no pubs in Castlemilk. So these people's their pub was still in town, and they still had to get home. And to me, everything you're saying about a lack of thinking about where we put houses and a lack of joined up thinking about transport links was summed up. I mean, that's what, nearly 40 years ago, it's 36 years ago that I was working in that pub. And these people were getting, because they didn't have a local and they were still going to their pub. So it's a problem that's been decades in the making. When I worked in the state agency, worked for Countrywide as they opened up in the Merchant City because of the number of houses. And I used to say to builders who are looking to move back in, it's a change of mindset, and it's going to take a long time to get this mindset, because we've just spent 50 years chucking everybody out of the city centre. To then persuade people they need to come back in, it's going to need more than just building properties. You're going to need to change mindsets, change public transport. And for me, as someone who worked in that industry, the wider thinking that you're talking about wasn't part of that process. There was lots of construction going up, but there was no wider thinking to it. So how do you get that change of mindset, and how do you get that wider engagement?
Well, I might argue that one of the biggest changes in policy thinking is and this isn't just a Scottish thing, this is a UK thing, is the recognition that working at regional level is actually a really important part of the governance structures. I think it's a lot easier for us to design proper city regions. Glasgow City Region is an economic unit. To subdivide that down into 8 local authorities and assume that they can all be operated independently, or indeed to try and make policy decisions at a Scottish level to deliver at a regional level when each of the separate departments isn't well integrated. That's where so many of these disconnects occur. So I'm looking at, okay, great, there's a housing bill coming out trying to deal with issues to do with cost of living crisis and the implications that has for existing tenants in housing-based communities. Fully understand that. But in terms of encouraging investment, that might in due course lead to a much, much more cohesive or coherent city region, where the right houses are going up with the right buildings. With net zero in mind, we seem not to be making that joined up thinking happen at the national level. We are much more likely to make that happen at the regional levels, I would argue. And I think we're quite well down the track as a consequence of city deal structures, quite well down the track to seeing those regional governance structures come to play.
And in terms of the city centre that you both touched on, it was occurring to me as you were both speaking. There is an example, using the pub example, and people being moved out and not having the facilities, the amenity that they expected. Isn't our city centres just prime to be housing led in terms of their change, because they've already got all of these amenities and good infrastructure and good transport? I suppose the challenge must be to make sure that we see a transformation in our city centre before, hospitality feels that it's already gone from the city centre or other amenities. And presumably that's the kind of issues that you're grasping with as well, Stuart.
Yeah, and when you actually look at what are the most controversial issues about the city centre at the moment, you'll see things like, well, are we preserving our built heritage? How many stories have you read recently about, there's another building under threat and somebody has to do something about it? Where's the public budget being allocated to save that building? Or we're talking about, well, isn't every project coming through at the moment student housing? How much student housing can we, bear? Do we need all these student houses? And by the way, why is it the universities are having financial challenges at the moment? And you just say to yourself, well, each of these is interconnected. And if you put into play a policy that is going to make it less attractive for private sector players to invest in housing, in buildings in a city centre, which are by their nature much more difficult to convert into housing, they have a history. There are planning regulations that have to be adhered to or have to be worked with. And there are net zero retrofit costs attached to taking heritage buildings and turning them into housing. So can we think, okay, well, it's no surprise that everything is now student accommodation, because that's the only thing where the demand has been very strong. And you've put in legislation that makes build to rent much less attractive, never mind all the costs of conversion. Could we have a wee bit of thinking about how you might take policy into a wee bit more sophisticated channeling to say, well, what can we do to try and make it easier to convert heritage buildings into housing in city centres, whilst at the same time structuring an appropriate rental mechanism through the housing bill? But it doesn't appear that joining up of thinking happens at a national level. It's much easier to do at a regional level.
Oh, you're finishing what was running through my head. It makes the case for regional decision making, doesn't it? And what about office accommodation? How's that in the city centre? I've heard you speak so often in the last couple of years post-COVID about the need for our economy needs people to return to the city centre. But is the office market strong? Is it likely, is there going to be a challenge as we go forward about thinking about the opportunity, the opportunities that current office accommodation for conversion? Where is it all sitting just now? I suppose kind of maybe what I'm hinting at is regardless of whether people are in the office or just now, do you have a sense on what its future is and how that relates to future housing policy?
Yeah, and I guess that's why, again, we're not seeing a huge pipeline of office investment at the moment for the reason that you know well, which is that end users are making their own judgments at the moment about what their office needs are going to be, given everything that's happened with hybrid working. We've just done a survey with city centre companies on hybrid working, and some interesting messages have come out of that. We must expect hybrid working to be here to stay. That's probably the top message. But there's probably some nuances around it that will develop over time. So it probably hasn't reached its final state, particularly, I have to say, with larger companies. The smaller companies seem to be quite enthusiastic about hybrid working because it's allowing them to compete in a tight labour market to hold on to talent by being flexible and offering that kind of style of working. But for the larger employers, I think there's a wee bit more doubt about whether hybrid working is working for them in terms of productivity. So there's some signs of tightening up, whether that's the common policy is 3 days a week in the office. but perhaps there wasn't that much enforcement. The tightening up may be that is now being perhaps more regularly enforced, and there may be a little bit more of a push towards a slightly higher rate of use of the office over time. That's still to be settled. But I think we've got to assume that it's going to be marginal change over the next few years. It's not going to be a sudden radical shift back to 5 days a week. I might argue that the public sector has been particularly, how shall we say, tricky around this, and that the policies appear to be almost non-existent. It's pretty much a free-for-all, whereas the private sector has been very clearly moving towards establishing a balance between home working and office work.
But that must be a specific challenge. It's a specific challenge in Glasgow, then, given the dominance of the public sector in our economy.
Well, I actually think Glasgow doesn't have a dramatically different city centre dominance of the public sector. You can imagine Edinburgh's got a very high public sector presence, given the nature of where the government offices are and where the Parliament is. And some of the other English cities like Liverpool, they're not that different. I think the big difference for us has tended to be that we have been pretty heavily dependent on pretty large-scale employers. The financial services district is the classic example of that. That, again, partially because, if you go back those 40, 50 years, we decentralised our businesses out of the city, the core city centre, to a much greater extent than other cities did, just the same as we did with the population, hence East Kilbride, hence Livingston, for goodness sake, hence Cumbernauld. So as a consequence, we had, I think, a greater dependence on larger employers in a smaller number of industries, and particularly the financial services industry, were perhaps a little bit more cautious about coming back in to the office in Glasgow. But that was reinforced by the lack of policy within the public sector. So there was real concern amongst employers that they didn't want to put their head above the parapet on trying to be more strict on hybrid working, whilst there were alternatives to draw their talent away, and that has, I think, become self-reinforcing.
One of the things in terms of Stephen touched on, and you've touched on about the heritage buildings in the city, so talking that offices and then relating to Glasgow, I mean, obviously one of the challenges of any public policy about trying to do stuff is so much of the property is privately owned. So it's, again, how do you give people incentives to encourage them to move to where you want them to be? But you'll know better than me. So anecdotally, my perception of going round Glasgow is there have been a reasonable number of new office buildings go up, and they seem to be reasonably full. And the sort of traditional Blythewood Square, Bath Street, for people who know Glasgow, older sandstone buildings, you'll see to let signs in the office space all along there. So my perception is that companies are moving around. The amount of corporates, legal firms that every 4 or 5 years you get headed paper telling you they've moved office. So my perception is that they are going round to the newest building with the newest just walk in, plug in, start. And that the consequence of that is the 120-year-old sandstone buildings are not sexy anymore to go in and plug in and start. They don't have everything that people are looking for. And that's where the challenge is of the demand on the office side. So very simplistically, I then look at somewhere like Park Circus and say, well, Park Circus was a success. It was residential, over 120 years it's gone residential, commercial, principally back in the last 20 years, principally back to residential. Should that not be something that we are trying to replicate? Say, Blythewood Square strikes me as the obvious place where you would then try and say, right, okay, all of these sandstone properties, because Glaswegians seem to like older properties. I live in one; they cost a fortune to maintain, and that's life. So how would you do that?
Yeah, and I get you're right about that general trend that the particularly larger employers are looking for the most contemporary facilities. It's partly, again, the battle for talent. They need to provide the right facilities to make sure that they're able to hang on to their staff, the talented staff. And I've had the pleasure of having the guided tours around JP Morgan's office, Barclays' office, Virgin Money's office. They're all brand new. They're all the kinds of offices that you would have thought kind of Silicon Valley startup would have been providing for their staff. That's a pretty common atmosphere that they're trying to create for staff now. And I think that's great. That's exactly what we need. But on the other hand, there's also quite a bit of demand for co-working space. Hasn't quite hit Glasgow at the levels it did other cities. And maybe that was around perceptions about where the business base was going. Some of the stats on the business base in the Glasgow City region are very, very encouraging. And I do think co-working space, there's still quite a lot of potential. You'll see the social hub opened up in Candleridge as a good example of that. So it's still that is feasible. And I think McClellan Works up at Surrey Hall Street has done well around that similar kind of model. So I think there's something more in that. However, incentives. I do think that how you convert existing buildings into that kind of use does need some intervention. I would start off by saying, can we stop introducing policies that make it economically harder? So, the very least, the housing bill at the moment, what has it done? It's switched off pretty much all build-to-rent programmes in the city centre. Can't say for the rest of the city as a whole, but certainly in the city centre. That almost came to it's almost dried up, it's almost gone. And it's all switched to student accommodation as the alternative feasible economic investment. But again, almost entirely new build. So we started saying, well, we've got one example where a tax incentive did work on the use of heritage buildings for an alternative use. And that was the business premises renovation allowance that ran from 2007 to 2017 and encouraged some of the older buildings to be converted, in our case, into hotels. That was one of the outcomes of that scheme. Something like the Hotel Indigo would be a great example of a scheme. Someone like Ramsay Duff at Maven Capital, he would tell you all about how that works and why that works. And we think that it's time to have another look at a building, a business premises renovation allowance, but with a residential end use. Yeah, but you could focus it purely on certain types of building in certain geographies. BPRA was focused on specific geographies, and we could do the same again. And you can be, there are lessons learned about how quickly sometimes tax incentives are manipulated by clever investors. But I think it's worthwhile looking again at whether that could be redesigned and reused for city centres, particularly for heritage buildings, and for perhaps for a certain length of time, maybe for 5 years.
I think that there's some really interesting ideas in there, and I think we've got a topic on its own of built heritage that we'll maybe need to focus on as a podcast. I wonder, as we're beginning to draw near the end of our particularly interesting podcast today with you, Stuart, you mentioned Clyde Gateway and the much of it being born out of the spin-off of the Commonwealth Games. I wondered if you have any insight, and this might be time dated by the times we broadcast it, as to whether Glasgow is going to be the host of the 2026.
Well, indeed, it will be time dated. I'll be absolutely convinced the decision will have been made one way or the other by the time you broadcast it. But it is very interesting. My perception is that this will not happen unless the UK government ponies up for the budget for it. I don't think that collectively we're that enthusiastic about trying to rifle through already existing stretched budgets to try and put on a substandard Commonwealth Games. We've already done this. We did it brilliantly 10 years ago. Why would we want to do something that's kind of second rate? But if the money is made available, then I'd be very enthusiastic about doing it, because one thing is that Glasgow knows exactly how to deliver these complicated events and do them very, very well. And we almost invariably find a way of exploiting them for either economic redevelopment, or indeed for cultural redevelopment. Something that's been done with major events in Glasgow for the past 10 years is associating the cultural programmes alongside them. We know how to do it. Just give us the money. Just give us the money and we'll do it properly.
I always remember when the announcement was made. I was in East Kilbride, and if you know East Kilbride, then you're coming down, you can see the whole of the city. And I always remember the announcement was getting made by you, Stephen. And at the time, there was that Glasgow was getting it the first time round. There was a giant rainbow went from the city centre and landed virtually on top of Celtic Park. And I thought, well, Glasgow's definitely getting the Commonwealth Games, because there's the rainbow saying that we're getting it.
There's so much can be said there. Well, on that cheery note, I think we'll end and allow our viewers and listeners to make their own comments about rainbows in Celtic Park and Commonwealth Games and who made announcements.
Anyway, Stuart, that's been brilliant. Thanks very much. And yes, I think we do need to revisit repurposing heritage buildings.
You're most welcome. Thoroughly enjoyed that. Thanks, guys.
No problem, cheers, Stuart. Thanks for your patience.
Not at all.
So if you, that's us. Magic. Thanks, Stuart.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening to the Scottish Housing Podcast with Stephen Purcell and me, Brian Gilmore. To ensure you don't miss an episode, please follow us and subscribe wherever you pick up your podcasts. To find out more about the presenters, go to scottishhousingpod.com, and to get all the latest information about forthcoming guests and new episodes, follow us on social media at Scottish Housing Pod.
The Scottish Housing Podcast is brought to you by the Right Business Centre. Located just off the M8 in Glasgow, we have office space to suit all companies from the smallest startup to a large corporate business. Right Business Centre also provides virtual office services like mail handling, creating a seamless virtual operation for remote teams or startups. Whatever your business needs, go to rightbusinesscentre.co.uk.
Welcome to the world of hassle-free property management with Indigo Square. As a premier residential lettings and property factoring service, we pride ourselves on tailoring our services to meet the unique needs of each client. Whether you're a landlord seeking a professional agent to handle the complexities of new legislation, or a homeowner in a shared building looking for seamless repair solutions, Indigo Square has got you covered. Say goodbye to stress and hello to peace of mind with Indigo Square. To discover how we can simplify your property management experience, visit our website at www.indigolits.com or drop us a line at info@indigolits.com. Your property deserves the best. Choose Indigo Square.
Introducing 2010 Land Consultancy, a dynamic and specialized team of experts dedicated to navigating the complex world of public affairs, planning consultancy, and business development. Based in Glasgow and serving clients across the UK and beyond, our agile team offers unparalleled expertise to public, private, and civil society organizations. With a strong network of connections in Scotland and beyond, Stephen brings invaluable insights and strategic guidance to every project. So choose 2010 Land Consultancy for innovative solutions, unparalleled expertise, and a commitment to driving success for our clients.